What is money? So here we are in another episode of Crypto Whiteboard. Today we're going to be talking about what is money. The reason that we're talking about this is because yesterday was April Fool's Day, and in our April Fool's video, we were able to trick a lot of people into thinking that Bitcoin had actually been banned by the SEC, and the reason that we were able to pull off that prank was because of the way that the media talks about cryptocurrency. The media often refers to Bitcoin as money, or even sometimes as currency, when really, technically speaking, Bitcoin is not either of those things. So in this whiteboard video, I want to break down what is money, what is fiat, what is currency, and how Bitcoin fits into all of that. Let's jump right into it. Money is anything that is widely accepted as a form of payment for goods and services, and repayment of debts in a given society or economy. This is pretty much universally true throughout history. Any society, whether it's ancient Rome, Mesopotamia, modern-day US, China, India, South Africa, doesn't matter where you are. Money is something that is used to facilitate the exchange of goods and services, and it's also used to facilitate the exchange of debt. There's two very important things to note from this definition. The first one is that money has to be widely accepted. If you have something in your pocket and you walk into a store and they don't accept it as payment for goods and services, then it's not money. Now this can change over time. For example, the United States dollar, the euro, these are all things that were not widely accepted at some point in time, but they became widely accepted over time. But at some point in time, they were not money because they were not widely accepted. The second thing to note is that money is used for two things: payment for goods and services, and repayment of debt. These are the two functions of money. Now let's move on to fiat. Fiat is a fancy Italian word that roughly translates to "let there be." In the context of money, fiat is when the government declares something to be money. This typically happens when the government passes a law saying that from this point forward, this piece of paper or this coin is legal tender and it must be accepted for the payment of debts, public and private. The US dollar, the euro, the pound sterling, all of these are fiat currencies. They are things that the government said should be money. You may have noticed that the phrase legal tender came up right there, and it is important to understand exactly what legal tender means because it really goes to the heart of the debate around fiat versus crypto. Legal tender means that the government is guaranteeing the value of the currency. If you lend someone $100 and they refuse to pay you back, you can take them to court and the court will force them to repay you that $100 because the US dollar is legal tender and therefore it must be accepted for the repayment of debts. This does not apply to cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is not legal tender anywhere in the world. A fun fact about the US dollar is that it is actually not legal tender outside of the United States. So if you go to Canada and you try to pay someone with a US dollar, they do not have to accept it because the US dollar is not legal tender in Canada. This is why in Canada you would use the Canadian dollar instead, and the same is true for every other country in the world. One of the most important things to know about fiat currency is that it is centralized. It is issued and controlled by a central authority. That central authority can be a government, it can be a central bank, but there is a central authority that is controlling the issuance of the currency, and they also set the rules for how that currency is to be used. Let's move on to currency. Currency is simply the physical representation of money. So the coins and paper bills that we're all used to dealing with. These are both examples of currency, but currency itself is not money. The coins and paper bills themselves are not money. Instead, they are simply the physical representation of money. In the same way that when you buy a stock in the stock market, you don't actually get a piece of paper in the mail, you just get an electronic record of your ownership in the company. The same is true for currency. The only difference is that with currency, there is a physical representation of it, whereas with stocks, there isn't a physical representation. It is important to realize that there are lots of forms of currency besides just coins and paper bills. For example, if you use the United States dollar, then your bank account is full of digital currency. When you transfer money between bank accounts, it's not actually moving any coins or paper bills. Instead, it's just changing numbers on the computer screen. The same is true for almost all cryptocurrency. Almost all cryptocurrency is actually just electronic records stored on a distributed network. The only exception to this is something like Litecoin, which does actually have physical coins that you can purchase. But if currency is just the physical manifestation of money, then what actually is money? What we just discussed earlier, money is anything that is widely accepted as a form of payment for goods and services, and repayment of debt in a given society or economy. So how does this relate to cryptocurrency? Does cryptocurrency count as money? Well, the answer is maybe. Again, this is because money is not something that is inherent to the object itself. Instead, it is something that is assigned to the object by the people in the society. For example, in the early days of the United States, people would use something called tobacco as money. People would use tobacco to pay their taxes. They would use tobacco to pay their debts. They would use tobacco to buy goods and services. Tobacco was not intrinsically valuable as money. Instead, it was the people in the society that gave that value to it. So for example, Let's say that tomorrow, the president comes out and says that from this point forward, gold will be the official currency of the United States. If he did that, then suddenly gold would become money in the United States, even though nothing about the gold itself changed. It's still the same metal, it still has the same weight, it still has the same properties. The only difference is now, it's being used as money within the United States. This means that if enough people in society agree to use something as money, then it can become money. This is why some people refer to Bitcoin as a community currency. At this point in time, Bitcoin is not widely accepted as a form of payment for goods and services, or repayment of debt. There are places that you can go and spend your Bitcoin, but they're few and far between, and it's not widely accepted. However, the more people that adopt Bitcoin and the more merchants that start accepting it, the more likely it is that Bitcoin will become money. If it does become money, then it will fulfill the first part of the definition of money. It will be widely accepted as a form of payment for goods and services. However, it will never fulfill the second part of the definition, which is widely accepted as a form of payment for debts. This is because, remember earlier we talked about how fiat currency is legal tender. The government guarantees the value of the currency, and therefore you can use it for repayment of debt. Bitcoin is not legal tender anywhere in the world, and therefore you cannot use it for repayment of debt. Does this mean that Bitcoin is worthless? No, it just means that it will never be able to replace fiat currency like the US dollar completely. It might be able to replace it partially, but it will never be able to replace it completely. What does Bitcoin need to be tied to in order for it to be good money? Well, if you look throughout history at the different forms of money, everything has always been tied to something. For example, the US dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Gold and silver used to back the US dollar. At one point in time, you could actually turn in your US dollars to the government and exchange them for an equivalent amount of gold. That is no longer the case. Instead, the US dollar is now what we call a fiat currency, meaning that the government simply says that it's money. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are typically tied to a computer algorithm. The algorithm produces a limited amount of the cryptocurrency, and that scarcity is what gives it value. If the algorithm says that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins produced, then the scarcity of it, the limited supply, is what causes it to have value. So in conclusion, there is a lot more to money than meets the eye. Something can be money without being physical. It can be digital. Money can be tied to precious metals like gold or silver, or it can be tied to a computer algorithm. But ultimately, it's up to the society to decide what is money and what is not money. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helped clear up some confusion around money, fiat, currency, and cryptocurrencies. Remember, be excellent to each other.